Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar. Our topic today is Retrofits for Resiliency, how to make an existing solar PV system into an islandable resilient power system. And this webinar is a presentation of the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, also known as ESTAP. ESTAP is a project of the Clean Energy States Alliance, and our host for this webinar today is Todd Olinsky-Paul. Todd is the ESTAP Project Director here at CISA. And before I pass it over to Todd, I would like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. So all of our audience members today are muted by default, and you have a couple of options to connect to the audio portion of the webinar. You can call in using your telephone, and there should be some info on your screen if you select the telephone option with how to dial in, or you can connect using your mic and speakers. Now today, unlike most of our webinars, we are opening the floor to questions and comments from the audience. We would really like to hear from municipal, state, and federal representatives. So you can either type your question in, or we're actually encouraging people to raise their hands so that we can unmute you so you can ask your question that way. And to raise your hand, you click on the little blue circle with the yellow hand and the green arrow on your webinar console, and we will see that your hand is raised, and during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar, we can call on you. You can ask your question out loud. So we encourage you to do that. You can also type your questions into the webinar console in the question box there at any point during the webinar if you have a question or if you have technical difficulties or any questions at all. Finally, this webinar is going to be recorded. Slides and a recording of the webinar will be posted on our website at cisa.org/webinars. And with that, I would like to pass it over to our host, Todd Olinsky-Paul.
Okay, thanks very much, Samantha, and welcome everybody to the webinar. This is a presentation of our ESTAP program, the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, which is a program of the Clean Energy States Alliance under contract with Sandia and funded by U.S. Department of Energy. And as Samantha stated, this is going to be a little different than our ordinary webinars that we do all the time, because we will have a verbal discussion feature. Primarily, that's intended for state, municipal, and federal folks. So if you're participating and you are working, at a state agency, a city, town, federal agency, and you want to participate in the discussion verbally, ask a question verbally, we're going to give you a way to do that. You can still type in your questions as usual, and anybody on the webinar can do that, and we'll get to as many of those as we can as well. So I'm going to do a brief introduction of the ESTAP program and CISA. I'm going to introduce our speakers, and then we will go right into the featured presentations. And questions will be and comments will be addressed after the presentations are done. So if you could advance the slides, please. So as I mentioned, we're doing this under the auspices of Sandia National Laboratories and U.S. DOE Office of Electricity. So thank you to Dr. Emery Zook at DOE and Dan Borneo at Sandia for making this possible. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about our ESTAP program. This is our energy storage program. As you can see by the map there, we work with states all over the country on energy storage deployment and also policy and program development. Basically, we bring states to the table to partner with Sandia and DOE to get energy storage demonstration projects developed, and also to support the states in their efforts around storage. Next slide, please. So oh, there we go. I was wondering what happened to that one. I just include this slide because it gives you a couple of places to go on our website to get more information. On the left, you see a red arrow that's pointing to the menu item that says ESTAP Webinars. We record and archive all these webinars. This one will be archived as well. And so we now have several, I don't know how many, at least 3 years worth of webinars archived on our website. You can go and view them at any time. If you want information, invitations to future webinars and information about our reports and newsletters and all our other information, you can click on the big green button there that says sign up for this emailing list, and you will get information in your inbox about future events that you may be interested in. Next slide, please. So with that, I will introduce today's guest speakers, not in this order, but in order that they will be speaking. So we're going to start with a presentation from Chris Larson, Senior Sales Engineer with Dynapower here in Vermont. Chris heads up the Eastern U.S. and European business development for Dynapower's Energy Management Systems Division. He joined the renewables and storage industry in 1996, heading up the North Carolina Solar Center's Grid Interconnection Program and the Desire database, which many of you may have used. It's the database for state incentives for renewable energy. He then spent 10 years with ABB. He has a master's in mechanical engineering through the North Carolina State University program in renewable energy and graduated magna cum laude in economics from Princeton. After Chris's presentation, we will hear from Dan Cohee, Vice President at PDE Total Energy Solutions. PDE is Pacific Data Electric, and they are in California, and they are an EPC firm. So Dan oversees the Advanced Energy Division there. He leads the design, implementation, integration, and construction of advanced energy storage and distributed generation projects. He recently completed the Cuisinart microgrid in the Caribbean, which powers a reverse osmosis plant producing up to 300,000 gallons of water each day using solar PV as a power source. He also recently completed the Port, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Port Hueneme off-grid photovoltaic and flow battery microgrid for the CEC. And he's currently managing the design and construction of 3 military microgrids and 2 commercial microgrids. He's managed design build of over 30 megawatts in DC energy storage projects. We're also joined today by Ben Schenkman of Sandia National Laboratories. Ben won't be presenting, but will be on hand to field questions. He works in the Energy Storage and Microgrid Department at Sandia and has been there since 2004. He's currently a senior member of the technical staff. His current work involves microgrid control theory, microgrid assessments, battery management systems, energy storage design and implementation, distributed generation and modeling distributed and renewable energy in the distribution and transmission systems. He's a member of the IEEE and Western Electricity Coordinating Council, WEC, and he's been on numerous advisory and review panels for the Department of Energy and Department of Defense. Previously, he worked at Texas Utilities as a distribution engineer and at the Public Service Company of New Mexico as a bulk power engineer before joining Sandia. He has a bachelor's and master's degrees from New Mexico State University with an emphasis on power engineering and deregulation economics. So that's our panel for today. Very happy that you could all join us. I want to mention that we have a very good audience. We've got 155 people logged on so far to participate in the webinar. So we'll do our best to answer all your questions. Please do, if you're writing in your questions, do that as you think of them. If you're planning to raise your hand to ask verbally, we will do that, take those at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Chris Larson from Dynapower for our first presentation. Go ahead, Chris.
Great. Thanks, Todd, and Sam for pulling this together. And thanks for everyone who's joined us. This is a great audience. And yeah, I just want to reiterate that by all means, certainly raise hands if there are questions. I think it's a more valuable and interesting webinar if it's interactive. So by all means, don't don't hesitate to interrupt as we dive in. So I work for Dynapower. For those who are not familiar with Dynapower, we've been around for about 50 years, cut our teeth in the rectifier market. So we've been doing power electronics for many, many years, principally large, high-power rectifier systems. Recently, about 8 years ago, started to move into the storage space. We now have about 220 megawatts of storage inverters installed all over the world. So what we'll talk about today, of course, is let's look at these solar systems that are out there and how can we actually come back to an existing solar array, retrofit that with battery storage. So I'll I think perhaps to help frame the discussion, the slides that I'll go through will give us sort of an overview of how we would go through this process. What are the options for performing a retrofit? Dan's got some great case studies that we'll sort of follow on. So we'll sort of go through some of the theory of how we would do this, talk some numbers as well, and then move on to the case studies that PD has been involved with. So one thing I think, as we're thinking about this, what Todd has sort of shared with us is that really the focus here is on resiliency. So how do we take an existing solar panel, or rather a solar array, and make it part of a response to a grid event? Obviously, we've had a number of events in the East Coast recently where resiliency has really become a key focus in the industry. But I think it's worth pointing out that resiliency is just one of the values when we look at a system that has both batteries and solar. And so I've got a matrix here sort of outlining the spread of values that we see. And I think this is important because while we're talking about resiliency today, the bottom line is that at some point we've got to figure out a way to pay for this. Right? If we're retrofitting a project with storage, there is a cost involved with that. And unless somebody has figured this out, there's not really a great way to monetize resiliency. However, if you've got batteries on the system, and you've got the proper controls in place, there are revenue streams obviously out there that you can take advantage of. The one that we all hear about and talk about, of course, is frequency regulation, a very active market. Perhaps the more valuable market, both near-term and long-term, is the peak charges, peak demand reduction. But I just want to throw this out there at the outset to say, while we're talking about resiliency and design for resilient system, one that can help in response to emergencies, at the end of the day, we're probably going to have to figure out a way to extract value from the system aside from the storm shelter type model. So let's sort of look at the stack within this, because at the end of the day, again, these projects come with a cost. And I think as we talk about batteries, it's worth taking one quick step backward. I imagine most folks on the call are very familiar with PV. The shift to the battery discussion, I think one very fundamental and important aspect that we have to discuss is the C rate on batteries. So I'm going to get into a little bit of jargon here, but I think it's valuable because it helps to sort of frame the discussion. You'll see on this particular slide we've got C over 2 and 2C. So what does that mean? And I'll try to describe this pretty simply. The C rate describes how fast you're able to charge and discharge the battery. So, because in the battery world, we're typically talking about kilowatt hours, right? 100 kilowatt hour battery, 1 megawatt hour battery. But the question is, well, how fast can you charge and discharge that battery? So a C rate represents the speed with which you are charging and discharging that battery, or the speed with which you can charge and discharge it. So a 2C battery is a battery that you can charge and discharge in a half an hour. A 1C battery is a battery that you can charge and discharge completely in 1 hour. C over 2 represents a battery that charges and discharges a bit more slowly. Full charge and discharge would be over 2 hours in that case. So basically, the higher the C rate, the faster you're able to charge and discharge the battery. And that's important because as we get into this battery discussion, and I just showed the slide with all these different value propositions with batteries, that C rate, the capability of the battery, is really going to define what you can and cannot do with that system. And as you skip ahead to look at the cost side, of course, the C rate is going to have a big impact on the cost. So let's perhaps put this into terms that make sense with this particular slide. So the top bar is illustrating, in this particular case, a larger battery. That is a battery that has a lot of energy that would discharge over a 2-hour period, which would be sort of the ideal case for a resilient type system where you are intending to have a lot of energy in reserve stored up for an event, a power outage. So this represents, and typically a great battery for that application is a lead-acid battery. Flow batteries as well fit into that sort of category. They have lower C rates, higher energy, but you're also paying for that energy. And that's why that gray bar is a bit bigger as a percentage of the total project when we're looking at these lower C rate, higher energy batteries. Whereas a 2C battery, of course, faster charge and discharge. More commonly, that would be a lithium-ion type battery. And the point there is that you can have, let's put some numbers on this, a 500 kilowatt battery that is 2C would have 250 kilowatt hours of energy. So for the same power output, in this case 500 kilowatt hours, a 2C battery is going to have half the energy, 250 kilowatt hours. So point is, the objective of the project is going to define which type of battery you're going to use, and which type of battery you use is going to define or sort of frame how much as a percentage of the project that the battery will contribute to the overall cost. What's interesting as you look at this is that the type of battery is not impacting the inverter cost as a percentage. So the inverter, if you have a 500 kilowatt inverter, it doesn't care if it has 1 megawatt hour of energy behind it or 250 kilowatt hours of energy behind it. I think everyone enjoys seeing these slides, so let's talk about the obvious. And the reason we're all on this call here today is because of what's happening with the battery pricing that you see on the right. So battery pricing is coming down precipitously, driven by a number of factors. We're seeing a lot of big players into the market, a lot of very creative chemistries, some very innovative startups, all sort of working together, driving down the cost. And that's why we can even have this conversation. I think this webinar, gosh, even 2 years ago would have been considered a rather fanciful topic, perhaps even irrelevant. But I think the way things have actually progressed, the dollars that we're seeing in the market for batteries, makes this conversation relevant. So I just sort of throw this out there for context that things are trending in the right direction. We saw this phenomenon with PV modules, and it's a very similarly shaped curve for the batteries themselves. And that's batteries of all chemistries. I think the one that we see in the headlines all the time is lithium-ion, and that's certainly part of the sort of the leading the charge and driving down costs, but we're seeing it across all the chemistries as well. On the inverter side, I guess a little bit less dramatic, but for those that are familiar with the balance of systems market, you're well aware that with the PV inverter commodities out there, you've seen prices come down based on volume production. So everything's sort of trending in the right direction. So let me jump to, I guess, sort of the heart of the matter for the discussion today. And we'll try not to get too much into the bits and bytes, but I think this is a very important distinction when we're talking about a retrofit. Well, do you keep the PV inverter? I mean, that's the question. So you've got a nice system that's operating. There's no problem with your PV inverter, but there's an interest in resiliency. So what do? Do you simply tack on the batteries with their own battery inverter, tie that into the system as presented here, or alternatively, do you rip out, in effect, the PV inverter and have a single inverter doing the job, carrying both the PV as well as the batteries? So I'm going to present these as option 1 and option 2. No value judgments there with how they're presented, but we'll sort of talk through some of the issues, and when we get to Dan's part of the presentation, we'll look at some of the projects where these different options have actually been implemented. So the option 1 here is theoretically the simplest. So if you've got a perfectly good inverter out there on the PV side, why can't we just pour a pad right next to it, set down the batteries, and set down the battery inverter next to it? And that's been done, and will continue to be done, and it makes a lot of sense. The considerations here, again, at the end of the day, if what we're trying to accomplish is a resilient system, at some point, and I do apologize because it's not in the slide here, at some point you've got to have a break from the grid, right? If we're creating an island, we've got to open up the connection to the main grid to support that load and continue operation. So what you're not seeing in this diagram, because it's a bit oversimplified, is that part of this process in creating a resilient system is actually going in with the controls and the protection equipment to open up the connection to the grid. Now, one of the projects that we just completed recently in in Vermont, the Stafford Hill project, that disconnect was on the medium voltage side, so it was a 12-4-7 disconnect. And that happened to be because the loads were pulling off that medium voltage grid. The disconnect can also go at the 480 volts level. Point is, there's a bit of complexity insofar as you've got to be able to come in and do a bit of electrical design work to be able to isolate your system from the grid. Another consideration, of course, is that once you've done that successfully and you've created an island, now you've got to balance the battery with the load with the PV. And there's some intelligence that's got to be built into this new inverter that's placed on the site, in this case the battery inverter, that is able to help manage that. And thank goodness there are a lot of companies out there that have gotten into this space, what I'll call the microgrid controller space, that can help do that balancing. At the end of the day, one of the considerations that you've got to, I'll frame this as a bounding condition. You want your battery inverter to be at least the size of your load. Perhaps to state the obvious, if you undersize your battery inverter smaller than the load in anticipation of having the PV there to help carry the load, of course you're relying on an intermittent resource. And so when we look at it from an engineering perspective, when we're asked to consider projects like this, the first thing we want to look at is what is the actual load that we're going to have on this islanded microgrid. And that becomes sort of the smallest size of the battery inverter that you would have. So if there are any questions, again, please jump in. I'm going to go ahead and jump to option 2 to highlight the contrast. And in this case, option 2, what you're doing is, in essence, pulling out that existing inverter or inverters, whatever the case may be. In this particular design, you've got a single inverter, what we're going to call a dual port inverter. So there are 2 DC ports coming in, one for the PV, one for the solar. I'm sorry, one for the PV and one for the battery, I should say. You've got a single inverter with a single set of controls monitoring both and doing that balancing for you and monitoring the loads. Within that inverter, you have that disconnect to break the connection to the grid so that you can support the loads directly off of the inverter. Obviously, one of the disadvantages here is that you're ripping out a perfectly good PV inverter. The advantage is that you have consolidated controls, built-in islanding capability. And again, this is an option. Now, typically, if we're going into projects, our experience has been that if we're going into a new project where we know it's going to be battery plus PV, this is the topology that we would typically recommend and that we've seen others use as well. But again, if we're doing a retrofit project, it's a choice, one or the other. So I think the advantages of option 2 is consolidation and simplicity of the controls, as well as that built-in islanding breaker to disconnect you from the grid and support the loads. So theoretically, in this particular case, there's going to be a little bit less EPC work, and Dan can speak more to the EPC side. But when we're looking at total system cost as the equipment cost, In this option 2, and I'll go ahead and jump to the next slide, option 2 proves to be a little bit more expensive from a CapEx perspective, but you end up finding some savings on the back end with the EPC side of things. Now, rough costs. Do not take these to the bank. These are intended to be sort of indicative to get people sort of thinking about what these numbers might look like. Tons of assumptions built in here. So in this case, what I've done to make this simple and as generic as possible, I've assumed a 1C battery. So in this case, a 250 kilowatt system, battery system, with a 250 kilowatt hour battery behind it. The math more or less works out as you scale up as well, but this would be a typical smaller size system, but obviously very appropriate for an emergency shelter. So if you've got a small facility or a medium-sized facility, this might be an appropriate size, particularly if you're coupled with solar. Again, the whole point of doing this is that you've got a battery, in this case 250 kilowatt hours, that is getting recharged via the sun during the outage. So option 1, again, this is where we've taken a site, added a battery, kept the PV inverter, and in this case there's some controls integration costs as well as the upstream islanding breaker that would be built into to this costing. Option 2, the controls integration is sort of inherent in the equipment, so that more or less is pulled out of the equation. And the upstream islanding breaker, as I mentioned, that would be built into this dual port topology. The exception would be, and this happened to be the case with the Stafford Hill project, where you need an islanding breaker at the medium voltage level.
Just before you go on there, if you could go back to that, thank you, because I think we need a little clarification. So your rough costs are per what? So that's 90 cents to $1.10 per what?
Yeah. Thank you, Ty. Yeah, that's left out. That's dollars per watt. So when we talk about, so I've converted, what we would typically do in the battery world, we talk about dollars per kWh. So I've just done a conversion here to convert it all to dollars per watt.
And that's per watt of what? PV capacity? Storage capacity?
Of storage capacity. Again, the 250 kilowatts being the storage number. And in this case, I've again assumed a 1C battery. So I've sort of forced the definition of how big that battery is going to be. I said, okay, it's 250 kilowatt hours. So given that, it works out to, in this case, around $1 per watt for the equipment involved in the retrofit. I hope that clarifies.
Yeah. So it's based on the size of the battery, which is based on what? The critical load of the facility, I'm assuming. So,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, you would start with that. You'd start with the critical load of the facility and say, okay, well, our critical load is, let's say, 200 kilowatts. So then you would say, okay, well, I need at least a 200 kilowatt battery inverter. And this, so let's round up and say you'd oversize it slightly, 250 kilowatt battery inverter. And then you would say, well, okay, how much energy do I need? So the power here is 250 kilowatts. That's how much power I need to supply the critical load in the worst case. Okay, so how much energy? How long do I need to be able to power that? So in this case, I've arbitrarily said, and this is again very arbitrary, a 1C battery size. Now we could argue, I think very easily argue, well, this is a resiliency discussion. Why are we talking about 1C? Why don't we talk about C over 2? Basically an energy battery, and that would make a lot of sense as well. And so we could look at a number of different ways of slicing this. So this is just one sort of snapshot.
Okay, and one more question, and then I think we have a couple of people who wanted to ask questions from the audience. So are these, I don't see anything here about soft costs or, engineering and so forth. Is this just strictly equipment costs? And if so, what kind of other costs are we potentially looking at?
Yeah, great question. So this is principally equipment. So this is equipment plus the integration, right? So so in option one, we're assuming that there's integration between the new inverter and the existing. So short answer is this is equipment with a little bit of the engineering integration. The soft cost you're talking about, in this case, we're talking about installation, the actual labor to pour the pad, run the conduit, et cetera, et cetera. You also have the overall engineering design, any permitting that's involved, any resubmission of the interconnection, which probably is not going to be necessary because you're staying under the limits of the original interconnection, but typically you would have to get the utility involved. Dan, help me out. Is there anything else? And I'm kind of jumping on Dan's discussion, so maybe I should stop there.
Yeah, I mean, every project is unique in pricing, obviously, based on the complexities or, retrofit that needs to be done. But all, very, we've done projects that have, if you take out the $1 to the $1.20 cost, you're looking, you could be equaling that on the cost of interconnect agreements, construction costs, pad costs, project management, permitting, engineering. That's typically what we're seeing, equal cost to the battery storage and inverter.
Okay, so we're looking at, just from an equipment point of view, assuming a 250 kilowatt capacity battery, we're talking about a $250,000 equipment cost plus soft costs. But what that doesn't show you is what your added value streams might be from such a system, because once you've added a battery and the other capabilities that the inverter that goes with the battery can provide, then you can potentially also see some revenues from this system. Would that make sense?
Absolutely, and I'll just throw out some numbers to help frame that as well. Because again, Todd, that goes back to the point I tried to make earlier, that somehow this has got to pay for itself, and so the revenue streams. We'll talk about capacity, the peak capacity charges or peak demand charges. For the Stafford Hill project, just again to use it as a reference because it's fresh in everyone's head. The customer in that particular case is looking at anticipated savings on the capacity charge side of, I believe it's approaching $2 million per year. Large system, right? So they were basically looking at savings of about $1 million per megawatt hour of installed battery. So yes, there absolutely are revenues on the other side of this equation.
Okay, great. So just in case that's not fresh in everybody's mind, when you refer to the Stafford Hill project, that's actually a utility project here in Vermont with a fairly large scale battery storage and PV installation on the utilities distribution grid, providing resilient power to a local school, which is serving as a community shelter and also being used to provide some other grid services. Before we go on, I did say that I would allow people to ask verbal questions. Had intended that to be primarily for state, municipal, and federal officials, but we have somebody who wants to ask a question, so I'm going to unmute Jamie Ortis. If you're there, please go ahead and ask your question. Okay, I guess Jamie has stepped away, so we will We have one other person, Scott Hunter, if you're there and you'd like to ask your question, I'm unmuting you.
We were just, we lost audio.
Okay, good. I can hear you just barely.
Tom,
Scott?
Yeah, that's why we raised our hand.
Oh, okay. So you're able to hear now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I guess that's it for now. Why don't you just go ahead and finish up your presentation, Chris, and then we'll move on.
Sure. So just a couple of pretty pictures here to help maybe help folks visualize what the heck we're talking about. So what you're seeing right here is an example of a cutaway of a standard shipping container that would house both batteries as well as an inverter. This is one way of doing it. You can also have a standalone inverter sitting adjacent to the batteries, but this is a type of system that's been deployed in a number of installations. In this case, it happens to be one of the dual-port design inverters where you've got the PV coming in, you see the PV recombiner, and then the battery sitting inside and both working through the inverter at the end of the building. So this is just a shelter to help folks understand what the heck this would look like. It's a 20-foot container with a 3-foot extension for the cooling equipment. So 23 feet long, 8 feet wide, gives you a sense of the footprint. And there's one in the flesh, or two in this case. This is a picture from the Stafford Hill project. Again, I don't want to dwell too much on Stafford Hill because it was not a retrofit, right? This was a designed system that incorporates batteries plus solar, but the same topology could be used for a retrofit. So what you see there are 4 containers. 2 of those containers, the large ones, contain lead-acid batteries. The smaller containers in the center, the darker ones, are from basically what I showed on the previous slide, where you have the inverter plus the lithium-ion battery states. So again, just a picture to show what this might look like in the flesh, and I'll sort of leave it to Dan to talk about some systems that are actual, true retrofits and to the topic for the webinar. So that's what I've got for now, and very happy to answer questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. We're going to move right into Dan's presentation. We don't have we do want to leave time for questions, so we want to move along. I just want to mention while we're queuing up Dan's presentation that the impetus for this webinar came from requests from some of our CSIS state members about how to, what would be required to retrofit existing PV to make it resilient and islandable. States have a lot of resources and money invested in PV, and all that PV that's out there on facilities, some of them critical facilities, will be useless during a grid outage unless it is retrofitted with this kind of equipment, batteries and islanding switches and so forth. So if any of you folks are here on the webinar from states that are interested in this, to take this opportunity to ask questions. Okay, Dan, passing it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm Dan Cohee, the Vice President at PDE Total Energy Solutions. We're a California-based general contractor, electrical contractor, as well as an EPC firm. We're very active in the microgrid space right now. 2 of the projects I'm going to go through and highlight here are actual retrofits, so I think they're very relevant to the topic today. Let me see here. This is a microgrid that we did. I'll give a quick overview here of a microgrid we did actually with a Dynapower inverter, and it was a 50 kilowatt microgrid which powered a small data center. It powered had a 36 kilowatt, you see the PV array, carport array, car charging stations, and part of the project's deliverables were to be able to island in the event of a power outage and continue their data center, keep it up and running from a combination of the PV and the battery energy storage. Forward here. The project in front of us right now is, sorry. Okay, so this project here is for the Department of Defense called ESTCP, which is the Environmental Security Testing and Certification Program. And the deliverables of this project were to demonstrate how a battery energy storage system could be integrated into an existing microgrid and PV array and be able to provide additional savings to the grid and be able to make it more resilient and reliable, and increase the reserve time that the microgrid could survive without fuel by integrating PV to it. So this project is located in Southern California at the 29 Palms Marine Corps Base. It's the military's largest Type 2B microgrid. Type 2B indicating that the renewables are designed to stay coupled in the event of a power outage, and so that was what the project was funded on here. This is a copy of the single line here, and as you can see, if you look at the bottom there, you see the battery energy storage, a Dynapower inverter again here, a GE Durathon battery is coupled directly to a 1247 PV array. The existing PV array is a 1.1 megawatt DC PV array. The microgrid is a 10 megawatt microgrid. It has a 7.1 megawatt Caterpillar gas turbine engine, and currently when the grid fails, the protective relays 1 and 9 will open up and isolate from the grid, and the PV breaker 17 is also tripped off because of the ramp rate constraints of the generator. So our project, coupled directly, we splice directly into the 1247 PV feeder, and we track the PV production, and the inverter either supplements the PV, which is varying, to stay within the ramp rate constraints of the cogen generator. So this is a real project in Southern California. Show that one. The next project here is a project in Southern California which has a 0.5 megawatt of existing rooftop PV. At the time in Southern California this is installed, it was the largest rooftop installation in the state. It's now been surpassed, obviously. But this project, the owner, again here, wanted to take advantage of the PV, wanted to create multiple value streams, and multiple value streams being demand-side management. They wanted to be able to island in the event of a power outage to provide their data center power. They wanted to be able to also be able to demonstrate new technologies and how to teach contractors and tradespeople how to integrate these systems in this developing market. Components here, again, a Dynapower inverter, batteries, solar, EV chargers, and a data center. The real fascinating thing about this project is its ability to, when it is islanded, to be able to control not only the generation, but to be able to control the loads as well. We monitor over 5,000 different points in this building, and we have discrete control over the central plant, the electric car charging stations, the lighting, the electromagnetic glass. So we have the ability to, when we're islanded, to be able to regulate what loads are operating on and off, to design the system to last as long as it can without any power from the utility. So in the event of an earthquake or a natural disaster in Southern California here, the design was set up so we could regulate the loads and power only the most critical loads based on the state of charge of the batteries. So the batteries it's a 676 kilowatt hour battery installation coupled with a 0.5 megawatt of PV and fully islandable, so in the event of a power outage, the facility can combine the solar and the batteries and provide power to loads, and load shed is required to be as resilient as possible. Again, very interactive project. Part of this goal is to teach and to demonstrate to municipalities and militaries and commercial businesses the ability to have a resilient microgrid design. So those are two real active projects that we have going now. We have three microgrid projects going on for the military right now. As we talked about earlier, Port Hueneme, we're developing the AC test bed for all NAVFAC microgrids, which is testing of technologies. We've developed a deployable microgrid with existing PV. And so those are just many of the options, but those are two very specific instances and examples of projects that we're working on right now.
Okay, thanks very much, Dan Cohee. We're going to go ahead and start addressing some questions. We have quite a few questions that have come in, and Chris, Dan, and Ben, all three of you should feel free to jump in on these. If you are on the webinar and you are a municipal official, state official, or federal official, and you want to raise your hand and ask a question verbally, please do so. Please make sure that you have a microphone if you're going to do that. Otherwise, we, of course, will not be able to hear you. So one question we have is from somebody who says, I manage a 1.5 megawatt project located on a hazardous waste landfill in New Jersey. The project is at the end of a long feeder. The load on site is pump and treat, and the system produces about 70% of load. Is this an opportunity that could make the site owner reasonable returns? I assume that the questioner wants to know if adding adding storage could result in returns, since he's already got 1.5 megawatts of PV, it looks like. Anybody want to take a shot at that? I should mention that New Jersey is in the PJM ISO, meaning that there's an active market for frequency response there, so that's at least one market that you could potentially sell services into. Anybody want to address the question?
Well, this is Chris, and I think the first thing that I would look at in that particular case is what does the tariff look like? You know, what rate plan are they under at that site? Because I think the even before potentially even more valuable than the frequency regulation revenue could be the demand charge reduction. I mean, that's sort of the first place that we advise people to look. So I think that you're going to get a lot of your answer there, and then look seconds to the frequency regulation market. But depending on the rate structure, there can be a lot of value in trimming that peak load or those peak demand charges.
Okay, great. Somebody wants to know regarding fast discharge. You mentioned faster recharging rates. This has to do with the C value of the batteries. The questioner wants to know, why is a fast discharge a good thing? And I'm not sure that's what you were saying, but maybe you could clarify that.
Yeah, so the I guess maybe the terms fast and slow maybe are not the best way to couch that, but think of it this way. If you've got a battery of a certain energy, a certain kWh, and really when we're talking about batteries, that's the primary factor, how much energy is in there, and then you secondarily are going to look at that C rate. But the point being is that if you are involved in a frequency regulation is a great example. You're going to likely, the optimal battery type would be a 2C or potentially even a faster battery, 2C, 3C, 4C, where you don't need a whole lot of energy. You're not supporting a load for a long time. In that particular market, you want to be able to deliver a lot of power. And again, we can use the example of 500 kilowatt inverter with a 250 kilowatt hour battery behind it. So what that means is you can pull out 500 kilowatts, but you've only got 250 kilowatt hours. So you would, if you pulled it all out in one fell swoop, it'd be gone in a half an hour. So that would be referred to as a faster battery. It's gone in a half an hour, the energy. So again, it all depends on your use case. So why would you want that? Well, if you're doing frequency regulation, you would want that. A quote-unquote slower battery, a C over 2 or slower, is great for these resiliency type projects that we're talking about. I hope that helps.
Hey, Chris, I'd like to point out as well is what we have seen and what PD has seen is when we are in an islanded condition and we have some systems that are completely islanded, only with PV and battery, we are only using about 10% of the capacity, the voltage range of the battery when the PV is on. We oscillate. We have over 14 months of historical data right now, and we're not seeing the battery when the sun is shining in a production standpoint. We're never seeing more than a 10% discharge of the battery. But as you stated, we are seeing constant variations up and down pulses to make up for the intermittency of the PV. And so, again, you're right, the battery topology, what we're seeing in an islanded condition is a higher C rate battery is more applicable and a less energy rate of less storage, which also makes it more economical, is what we've learned to be the solution at this point when islanded.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple questions about your options 1 and 2, Chris, from your slide deck. So one of them is, what's the loss in efficiency when using option 1 by going from PV DC to AC and back to DC to the battery and then back to AC? I don't know if that's clear, but that's the question.
Yeah, so the answer is actually pretty simple. It's going to be more or less the same for options 1 and 2, and here's why. Because whether it's 2 inverters in 2 boxes or it's in a single box, you're going through the same process. So this is getting into a little more detail perhaps than we need, but it's worth mentioning. When you have this option 2, you can do this one of 2 ways. You can have have them DC, connected, DC coupled topology or an AC coupled topology. And we've seen both, and we've done both designs, and there are reasons, and we don't need to get into that, of why you might do one or the other. But point being, yes, if you have a DC coupled design, you are skipping a couple of conversions when you're charging the battery versus an AC coupled design. So that's a great question, great point, and there are some potential savings there if you go with a DC coupled option 2 design, just from an efficiency point perspective. But we've done it both ways, such that option 2 would be equivalent to an option 1 from an efficiency perspective.
Okay, terrific. Somebody wanted to know if you could discuss a rough cost comparison between a retrofit and a new system. Is there a way to kind of boil that down and back of the envelope? What's the rough comparison between a retrofit existing PV and just a Greenfield entirely new PV and storage system?
Well, I suppose you could take some of the numbers that we've thrown out here, and I'm just trying to think of a logical way to address that. So the question is, what does it make sense? Which are we comparing? In this case, a retrofit versus doing a complete system, PV plus battery at once. Is that correct? I think that's what we're addressing.
Yeah, that's the question. So we talked about some sort of rough pricing on retrofits where you have existing PV, you're assuming a certain system size, you're adding a battery and an inverter.
Yeah. And
now the question is, how does that compare with starting from zero and installing a new system that's integrated?
I think, and Dan, I'd love to hear your perspective, but my sense is that a lot of those savings, it's not going to be so much on the equipment side. but a lot of it's going to be on the engineering, design, labor side, right? So if you've already got a system out there and you've deployed a crew, civil, electrical, et cetera, to install the PV, and then you've got to, in essence, redeploy those resources for retrofit. It's the EPC labor as well as the re-engineering costs that are going to be the main difference there, not as much the equipment cost.
Okay. So, but if you have existing PV out there, so I guess the question is, from the point of view of a municipality or of a state, for example. So there's existing PV out there. We know that there's PV on schools. We know that there's PV on municipal buildings. These are potentially critical facilities. Does it make more sense to, and you may not be able to answer this, I'm just sort of, I think this is the basis of the question. Does it make more sense to look at those existing systems and say, where can we add, a battery and an inverter and achieve resiliency? Or is there some compelling reason to not do that and say, well, let's look at Greenfield sites? And I'm guessing that it really depends more on the specific situation at the specific facility than anything else.
Okay, yeah, that's a good. So yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it, because yeah, you've got a sunk cost in the existing system, and how much, I guess, put differently, how much of a hassle factor is there going through the retrofit process? Todd, I think you summed up when you said it's going to be very site specific, and I'm not sure that I could answer it any better than that, except that you're right, it would be site specific. In general, to state perhaps the obvious, in general, if you've got a rooftop PV system, typically those are more complicated to integrate in with because you're dealing with building constraints within a building, versus a field mount PV system where the retrofit would be theoretically a bit more straightforward.
I think I think what you need to take into consideration too is if you have an existing school with a 50 kilowatt PV array, then you need to take into consideration what loads you want to power as well with that array. So if you're looking to back up a much larger load than what your generation is, it's not going to pencil out because your battery is going to be so large. So in some instances you need to start from scratch, and in some instances you have to really look at your electrical infrastructure and what your critical loads are going to be and design that islandable load based on what your generation is. And you basically do a probability survival time of how long you can last with the PV generation and battery. That's what we find.
Well, this is fascinating. Unfortunately, we have a hard stop at 4 Eastern Time, which is in a minute. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. It seems like a topic it's worth following up on, so we will follow up on it and probably do future webinars and maybe a report. Thanks to our presenters and everyone who participated. And Samantha, any last words?
Well, there is some contact info up on the screen now, as well as a link to where you'll find a recording of this webinar and some info about signing up for our listserv where you can get more information about other upcoming webinars. And thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.